Hello and welcome to Hot Issues. Today we're going to take a look at politics in Kenya, Africa, and whether or not the right things are being done to enable the African people to realize their full human potential. And we shall be doing this with a very, very distinguished Kenyan politician. Welcome to Hot Issues. Hello and welcome back to Hot Issues. We are particularly privileged today to have with us the Secretary General of the Orange Democratic Movement of Kenya. He's a Member of Parliament and a politician whose experience spans a couple of decades. We are talking today to the Honorable Peter Nyongo, Member of Parliament of Kenya. Honorable, you're welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much, Kwesi.
Yeah. Honorable, what are you doing in Accra?
Well, I came for a conference on Pan-African conference on inequalities in the context of structural transformation, which basically is a meeting of various African scholars, policymakers, leaders, people from the development partners and so on, to discuss how do we deal with inequalities in Africa, given the kind of structural transformation that is needed to deal effectively with poverty and inequalities in our continent. That is really the subject matter of the 3-day conference here in Accra.
When you talk about inequalities in Africa, what are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that it has been said, and it's being repeated all over, and that over the last couple of years, quite a number of African countries have had phenomenal economic growth, but without substantial changes in poverty levels. Indeed, my country, for example, Kenya, has been going through economic growth since 2003, but we are now rated as one of the most unequal countries in the world, and perhaps next to Brazil. And if you find out that about 40% of the population is really poor, then you ask yourself, to what extent can we continue praising ourselves as growing economically? Well, almost half the population is not benefiting from this growth, or is just marginally benefiting.
What accounts from the disconnect between the growth rate and the poverty level?
Well, because of the character of the growth that we're having, it is quite possible to have tremendous investments, for example, in extractive industries like mining, or to have an era when a government is investing heavily in infrastructure. Roads are being built, railway lines are being built, telecommunications is growing. But you see, that may serve just a very small fraction of the business community and maybe people involved in trade. And of course, it may also mean that large-scale farming is also doing very well, and while peasant agriculture remains at a subsistence level. Now, subsistence agriculture is not the kind of agriculture that will give people a lot of income, especially when farm inputs are becoming more and more expensive, and when access to certain markets by the farmers in terms of their produce is becoming more and more difficult. And when, of course, also internally, the population that could grow as to the exact demand on agricultural commodities is not very well paid in terms of what they earn. So you must look at all these things. How do you get an economic growth that is organic and that makes industrialization and agriculture grow step by step? In fact, the best of all worlds would be when agriculture itself is industrialized. It's much more commercial. Productivity in agriculture is pretty high, so that for 1 day of work, you get much more return today than you did 10 years ago.
Now, if you industrialize agriculture, and if we had a lot of investments in industry and so on, and the investments were not African, and the commercial farming was not African.
Yeah, well,
couldn't it just lead to the outflow of resources in spite of the growth?
Yeah, but give you the example of my country, for example. Kenya is a very well endowed agricultural country. At independence, we inherited a good commercial sector in agriculture, mainly for export agriculture, coffee and tea, and we have continued to be a good exporter of tea up to this very day. Coffee has gone down considerably, but tea does very well. Over the last 20 years, we have also tremendously expanded our export of cut flowers, so that is also earning a lot of foreign exchange in Kenya. But if you look at the number of persons involved in the cut flower business, there are few large, mainly foreign farms, employing labor, which is pretty cheap, and earning a lot of money. So government, of course, gets it cut by taxing the exports and getting foreign exchange from what is exported. Now, the question asked is, to what extent can you rely on this model of commercial agriculture if the majority of people in the agricultural sector either has very low wages or still in subsistence? So now, tea, on the other hand, is different. At independence, we expanded small-scale tea production. So you get a lot of small-scale farmers involved in tea, and there's also state intervention in tea production in terms of Kenya Tea Development Authority, which has been an example on how you can bring together small-scale commodity producers in tea, give them a strong bargaining point in terms of exports, and then they get substantial sums of money from what they do. So it is not as if we don't have models of commercial agriculture that can incorporate the small farmer or the small-scale producer. We do, even in Kenya. But that model has not been expanded to other agricultural commodity production. So the challenge is, how do we begin commercializing agriculture so that you escape from subsistence farming, you get into commercial farming, even by the small producer, and you increase the income of the small agricultural producer to the extent that engaging in agriculture does not become a process of pulverization, if there's such a word, or impoverization, rather a process of improving the standard of living and incomes. I think that's a challenge in many African countries. Now, there are African countries where, because of the extractive industries, people abandoned agriculture a long time ago. The state just want to rely on the money earned from oil, for example, and then you import everything. I mean, this is absolutely non-sustainable. And in fact, the kind of social and political crisis that come in such countries, precisely because the state is encouraging a model of development which leaving a large section of the population outside the economic activities and economic inclusion, and only dealing with a small section which, though earning a lot of money from the state, does not spread that money to the majority in the population.
Isn't there a question also of the origin of capital?
The origin of capital is important. If you look, I'll give you the two examples of tea production in Kenya and cut flower production. Cut flower production, largely the origin of capital is outside. There are, of course, a few indigenous Kenyans who are involved in that kind of production, but they are fewer compared to the others, multinational big companies from Europe and so on. When you come to tea, however, there's a mixture of external capital which has been there since colonial times in tea production, the Inchcape Group and so on, but there's also substantial indigenous capital, both large-scale and small-scale peasant households. So, in fact, if you are going to transform the origin of capital in agriculture, the state must be involved substantially. There is no way in this day and time where you're going to have a green revolution or commercializing agriculture without substantial state intervention, because agriculture is extremely difficult to capitalize, you know. Our peasant household production, even in tea, depends very much on the generosity of nature, i.e. rain. Now, nature, you know, is not becoming very generous these days because of global warming. And so you must think of providing water to agriculture through irrigation, damming rivers and so on. And that's a lot of capital which cannot be done by a group of farmers coming together. It must be a state-led kind of infrastructural development in agriculture. And when you think of also access to markets, again, the state must intervene, either by having a negotiating power with external markets or creating infrastructure and financial wherewithal where farmers can arrange to have access to markets, and also to buttress themselves in the event that the weather fails and they could be ruined, where their capital can be wiped overnight.
But this recommended by the Bretton Woods institutions and other Western institutions. They say that the state should not be involved in the promotion of agriculture and industry.
Well, that was the biblical recommendation of the BAG report, you remember, in 1981, structural adjustment and so on. But it's now passé, really. If you look at countries which have been successful in transforming agriculture, whether it is India or China or even Mauritius for that matter, state intervention has been very heavy. Even South Africa under apartheid and what the Mandela government, the ANC government inherited, they do realize that you cannot just liberalize agriculture or the economy just like that. Now liberalization and privatization, as it were, religiously followed a la BAG report or the Washington consensus. It's not something that you can defend intellectually, really. I mean, even in practice. I've been Minister for Planning and National Development in Kenya for 3 years at least, when we were launching the Economic Recovery Strategy for Wealth and Employment Creation, which was a very ambitious recovery program for an economy that had been at doldrums for quite some time. And my battles were with both the World Bank and IMF on exactly what we were doing. And I told them, look, at least give us space to have a really indigenous, homegrown recovery process that first and foremost lays emphasis on the needs and resources within the domestic market. And not that we want to say we want autarky, no, but really you must find ways and means of strengthening your home market, and also of emphasizing regional integration, so that you have some kind of self-initiative in doing these things. So I think that in as much as the Bretton Woods institution wanted us in 1981 and down the road to liberalize and compete in the international market, they didn't realize that we were coming from a very disadvantageous position, a position that must mean that we must kind of prepare ourselves for war, economic war, domestically, before we think we can bargain on an equal footing, but are much more stronger and very aggressive partners in the developed world.
Africa has its own institutions, or institutions dedicated to African development, like the Economic Commission for Africa and so on. Now, how come that many African countries are still dependent on Western-sponsored and Western-promoted institutions?
I think, one, it's sometimes a question of self-doubt. You begin doubting your own institution, which is terrible, really. But on the other is also the conditionalities that are quite often associated with what is called partnership. Getting aid or having access to markets, or being given promises for foreign direct investments. I'm saying being given promises because sometimes they don't
meet those promises.
They don't fulfill those promises. I remember when I was Minister of Planning, we had a big meeting at Safari Park Hotel when the donors realized that our economic recovery strategy program was good. And we went to this meeting, and my colleague in finance was in planning. We had a whole day's meeting with development partners, and they promised they would make sure that they undertake or support substantial investment amounting to something like $4 billion within a short period of time. It was never to be. So this dangling of support for foreign direct investment is usually too good to be true. The thing is that I think every country must do its best on its own to attract investment. First and foremost, domestic investment. I mean, take Nigeria, for example. There's a lot of local capital in Nigeria. The government just needs to create an enabling environment for people to invest. Even in Kenya, One good thing in Kenya is that there have been a lot of corruption, of course, but it tends to be invested locally. It's not the thing that is exported lock, stock and barrel to Cayman Islands. We have had a few Cayman Islands stories, but it is not that big compared to what is invested locally. So the government must do a lot of work to create a healthy environment to attract investments. For example, just procedure to register a company. In Rwanda, it takes a matter of days, sometimes hours. In Kenya, it requires 87 days to register a company. I mean, anybody registering, and he knows that he can as well do it in Rwanda or Tanzania or Kenya, will choose a place where the process is easier and user-friendly. And secondly, transaction costs. If you have too many goalposts, too many checkpoints where an investor has to go through, for example, the issue of registration or the issue of licensing. If you require about 27 licenses to do business in one country, and there's another country where you require only one, and where the office where you get the licenses is only one, you'll find that these licenses are not really needed, but they are erected or created so that certain civil servants and bureaucrats can collect some money from those who are trying to do business. And these are some of the things that affect investments in our country, both domestic and foreign, which we must learn to deal with. They are kind of the ABCs of straightening the economy, but quite often they're very difficult to remove because of vested interest in our governments.
But the Europeans are still dangling things in front of us and asking us to sign the economic partnership agreement with the European Union.
Well, I think we must understand that the Europeans have their own interests. You see, it's kind of quid pro quo. Okay, do you want to export bananas to Europe, to the EU? I saw a program yesterday on TV saying that the Ghanaians must export their bananas to Europe through the EPA agreements, and if you don't sign those agreements, the bananas will go bananas. I think that we should not be blackmailed to enter an arrangement which in the long run is not in our interest. We must look at our long run interest. That's why the subject of this conference is important, on inequalities in the context of structural transformation. The most important thing is structural transformation. If you find that the only way you can earn money from the bananas is to export them to Europe, and an arrangement which is not really good for you in the long term, then think of structural transformation. You may refuse to sign the EPA thing. It may cause inconvenience in the short time. But if you structurally transform your economy and your trading patterns, maybe you'll get a better deal eventually. For example, if you say, look, we have found out that actually Saudi Arabia needs not raw bananas that are exported to Europe, but bananas which have been turned into banana chips, value addition. Then you create an industry which will produce banana chips and export them elsewhere without signing no agreement like EPA. The other thing is that, for example, I've been here a few days and I've realized that when I asked for some tea at Royal Palm Beach, what do you call it? Royal Palm Beach? Palm Beach Hotel.
The hotel.
Yeah. And I was given Lipton tea. Lipton tea is one of the worst teas, by the way. We're a tea producing country, so we know. Very good tea from Kenya. Kenya Airways comes here twice a day. So why can't we export tea to Ghana?
Why should Kenya be exporting its tea to Europe?
Because we must export it. We've been exporting it to Pakistan. We have opened a big to Egypt. We export to Russia. We export to Japan. We've really diversified our tea exports abroad. But I think we should export tea to other African countries, for example, West Africa. The mindset that our traditional markets for tea only exist in those places must also be changed. And then you may realize that we consume a lot of bananas and we don't produce enough. Okay, so we could, in actual fact, also get some bananas from Ghana. I'm just speculating. Of course, our neighbor Uganda produces a lot of bananas. but it's also consumed tremendously internally. Also, we may also change our diet, banana is a very healthy food, perhaps much healthier than corn. And we could use our corn to make corn oil, and use the bananas as a basic staple both in Kenya and in Ghana. And this is what structural transformation is all about. You think not out of the box, but out of the enclosure, let's say. There are too many boxes being thought out of. And then you do new things. And there are many countries who have done that. I mean, when Cuba was under siege by the Americans, they did a lot of new things. I've been to Cuba twice. They started producing their own pharmaceuticals from sugar. In fact, they exploited the sugar as a product so tremendously. From sugar, you get perfume, you get vaccines, you get detergents, you get alcohol, you get power to drive cars. So this one sugar on the Cuban islands really was exploited to death by the Cubans. So that one of the reasons why the health system in Cuba is so good is because before a baby is born, they receive at least 7 vaccines in the womb. So the baby comes out really ready to be a gorilla. You see what I mean? Strong, I mean. So I think in Africa, we should rely less on some advice we get from those people who want us to continue with the traditional structures of our economy. 2, we should have very aggressive thinking about transformation. And 3, regional integration is extremely important. I mean, we have structures of regional integration, but I don't know whether we have exploited them effectively enough. The Manu River Convention of States, ECOWAS, and all this East African community, they have tremendous potential to create dynamic home markets within the regions, and which would stimulate structural transformation within those regions much faster than we have been doing.
So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'd like us to go back to the conference, the Pan-African Conference, and to see how such conferences may or may not help us overcome poverty and structural inequality. Short break. Hello and welcome back to Hot Issues, and we are in discussion with Honorable Member of Parliament in Kenya and Secretary General of the Orange Democratic Movement, Honorable Peter Nyongo, is in the studio with us. So before we went, I'd raised the issue of how such conferences can contribute to dealing with the structural imbalance and poverty in Africa.
I think one good thing with this conference is that it makes people meet from various African countries and share ideas and lessons. And of course, when you have a very high-powered meeting like this one, one hopes that those ideas can find themselves into the organs of the state, and they, either through national government or through regional organization, they can then influence policy making. I think Africa is not short of ideas, to tell you the truth. Ever since independence, we have had many ideas, I mean, for this structural transformation. The difference is what kind of ideas lead to state action, and what kind of governments do we need to take these ideas seriously and use them for policy making and for change. I think that's where the disconnect has always been. That, for example, you read a lot of resolutions by the African Union, and they begin by saying, "We solemnly swear." They're very solemn, very, very pious about these things. But whether this solemn commitment to ideas and to policies eventually lead to actual action by the state to transform society and transform economies, it's a different issue. And one of the reasons why that doesn't happen is because of interests, both domestic and international. And we must break this jinx. First, there must be strong enough and determined leadership in every country and at the regional level, which once a roadmap has been set for action, it is followed to the end. I've been watching South Africa very carefully, the Republic of South Africa. South Africa seems to have an agenda, a very clear agenda for the SADC region, but also for other regions. You may find that here in Ghana, you have South African companies which are very aggressive. So South Africa seems to have a roadmap where it wants South Africa to go within the continent. And this should be in the interest of both South Africa and the African continent. I think every country should have that. I'm very critical myself on the way we form governments. Having now been in politics for about 37 years and in parliament for close to 25, and in the cabinet twice, first as Minister for Planning and National Development and then as Minister for Medical Services, I've seen how the way in which we form governments does not quite lead to long-term planning for social transformation. Even when you have a long-term plan and then it's broken every 5 years by election of presidents, and each president thinks that they must make a stamp in their own country, sometimes without following this long-term plan set up previously, there's a break. And I think what I've been calling political deficit is something that we must think about and find a way of dealing with it.
What is the cure?
I think
extending the term of office of our government.
No, I don't think so. The cure to me,
or jettisoning the multi-party democratic arrangement.
Yeah, I have no problem in multi-parties. I have a very strong defender of democracy, of human rights, and I think politics must be competitive, and through competitive politics, transparency, accountability must be improved, and I think we should have much more devolved government, effective devolution, not just extending the central government to the countryside. No, it must be effective devolution. Fortunately, now in Kenya we achieved that in the present constitution, which is really good. But the elephant in the room, to me, is really presidential politics. I think the mongrel type of regime that we have been using in Africa, where you have partly a Westminster parliamentary system, partly an American, will never serve Africa well. First of all, every 5 years, we engage in fratricidal wars to choose a president, leaving the country with less consensus than before. Then we decide, we have one president. There are those who have lost. Those who have lost begin plotting 5 years later to punish those who won. So it is a cyclical circulation of anger, political anger. I don't think this augurs well for long-term planning and political capital for social transformation. What we need is an institutional arrangement where elections to produce governments don't disrupt long-term planning. And I think the best example is a parliamentary system where you have a prime minister, where government is formed either the party which wins the majority or coalition parties. It has worked very well in very complicated societies like India, or less complicated like Singapore. And I'm doing a study at the moment looking at the suitability of parliamentary system of government led by Prime Minister to Africa as opposed to this mongrel democracy we are having. Because this one, when you look at countries which could be very prosperous like Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya are the ones which have had tremendous upheaval based on presidential election, not parliamentary or county or devolved. No. The elephant in the room is electing the president, and it is very disruptive. It can turn around the clock of social transformation many years. And why we should be so sadistic to invest a lot of political capital in this one office and every 5 years fight over it.
Because we've concentrated so much power.
Exactly.
In the
and we assumed, definitely, wrongly so. And then another thing, which I don't think it works here, but we are practicing in Kenya since the new constitution was brought into being, this idea of having a cabinet made of non-politicians, where the only politician in the cabinet is the president and his deputy, because they have been elected by the people. Well, my experience is you need to have a cabinet where you have a politician who can stand up to the president, who can tell the president you are wrong. Now, if the whole cabinet is of so-called technocrats and professionals picked up by the president, they are very unlikely to stand up to the president. So the president is likely to have his way and likely to be more influenced by the moneyed individuals who, or companies who perhaps bankrolled this election. So the democracy is then subverted by these powerful economic forces which are not accountable to anybody. And people who are elected by the people who could sit in the cabinet and keep the president are not there. So why do we do it? Just because it is an American system? America has a very different history from ours. And even in America, it's a problem, really, to tell you the truth. So I really think that if we wanted a Westminster model, let's adopt it. But I would add further that in Africa, we need to go further than that and have proportional representation as well as single constituency representation. And that when we form governments, a government should be formed by political parties in proportion to their numbers in parliament or the votes they get, so that we don't have what Nyerere once called football democracy. In other words, simply because you're not in government, you're in the opposition, just because of that. I mean, I think Nyerere was right, really. But if you have this proportional representation in government, so everybody has a stake, you must make sure that you go and bargain for your policies. That, okay, we are only two in this cabinet, but our party stands for this, and we'll only be here so long as these policies are also pursued. Then you also have a hybrid of policies which represent the mosaic of the nation. And that to me is much more inclusive.
Wouldn't that be taking the battles, the political partisan battles, into cabinet?
We assume that that would be harmful. you make a certain assumption that if you take partisan political party to the cabinet, it will be harmful. Maybe it will be better, perhaps much more productive, than having a uniform policy in the cabinet, which is the product of only a few people, or one mind for that matter.
Usually one mind.
Usually one mind. There's a conventional saying which says that two minds are better than one. I think that having that diversity in the cabinet, and especially if people finally agree on a roadmap and a long-term transformative process, is much better. And I think that in Kenya, what we did when I was Minister for Planning and National Development, we created what was called an Economic and Social Council. The Economic and Social Council was made up of a few ministers, but also people from the business community, professionals, and some people from the international community. And the Economic and Social Council was meant to advise the government on long-term policies. These are people who are not interested in the day-to-day running of government, but they ask the government, tell us, what do you want to do over the next 30 years? Give it to us, we shall sit down, discuss, and come out with a plan. And it worked very well, because from it, we produced what was called Vision 2030. Unfortunately, the present government is not taking the Economic and Social Council seriously, which is that's why I'm very much against this 5-year ping-pong game.
Now that you've brought in the issue of Kenya, what is your assessment of the last elections? Terrible.
Again, the last election, if you look at it, first of all, the Electoral Commission, Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, betrayed its name of independent. It was not independent. And I told them before the election, they were terribly infiltrated by the security apparatus of the state, and they became terribly partisan to the coalition which is now in power. And that was the problem, because then they had to either turn their eyes away from malpractices in the elections or encourage the malpractices. First of all, their incompetence was demonstrated when the electronic voter identification program collapsed, didn't work, and then they had to resort back to the manual process, which was very untransparent, if there's a word like that, and it just created a lot of a lot of problems, and especially for presidential election. I will tell you that, like the election of 2007, nobody can really tell who won this election. None of the candidates got more than 50+1% required to be president. But then in the end, somebody was declared to have done it without ocular proof that they did. So, and I think that if we continue with that independent and boundaries electoral commission into the next election, we'll again see another disaster. And I think that rather than engage ourselves in this sadistic arrangement every 5 years, where even a body called Independent Boundaries and Electoral Commission does not become independent, let us do away with that office called the presidency, which causes so much problems. If you have a parliamentary system, there will be no way by which the Electoral Commission would even attempt to subvert elections, because you will be electing so many members of parliament who finally, it's the number of the members of parliament who will which will determine who becomes the prime minister. You see what I mean? In the number of votes cast. So it will be the Electoral Commission actually will find itself insulated from accusations of being biased. So that is my assessment of the last election in brief.
But in spite of what you said, the Kenyan courts have held the results of the elections. They validated the results of the elections.
They did, but remember, we at the Coalition for Reform and Democracy, which is our coalition, we said we accept the decision of the Supreme Court, but we don't agree with it. The reason why we said we accepted the decision of the Supreme Court is because if we had disagreed, Kenya would have had another bloodshed, and we didn't want that. We looked at the long-term interest of the country and said, fine, we know that injustice has been done, but there's always another time, and it is not going to do us any good or the country any good if we challenge the Supreme Court. There were grounds to disagree with the Supreme Court. And now, in fact, recently there was a TV investigative program that was aired on our TV by the company KTN. It was called Jicho Pevu, which showed the malpractices in the electoral process and demonstrated that, given that information, it is almost impossible for anybody to say that the current president got the necessary constitutional requirement to be president. But since the Supreme Court said so, we decided to accept it. I think the Supreme Court must sit a little guilty of what it did, but the Supreme Court argues that that specific issue, whether somebody got 50+1 or not, was not put to it, but it was in the affidavit that they refused to look at.
Now, talking about Kenyan politics and elections and so on, it's been said around the world that the issue of ethnicity does play quite a huge part in Kenyan politics. Is that true?
It is true. I think it is true, but look, diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, racial diversity is perhaps, I think, in every African country, very rich for our own societies, in terms of language, in terms of skills, because our nations are made of diverse peoples, ethnically. But it's not a curse. It becomes a curse when it is used for politics of exclusion.
And when it leads to massive violence.
When it leads to massive violence. And when individuals decide to ascend to power walking on cadavers. You see, if your means to power is to walk on cadavers, then of course ethnicity becomes a curse. Like what happened in Rwanda. Or like what happened in Kenya 2007. The IC is still pursuing that issue up to now. What is happening in Sudan, South Sudan for that matter. So we really must create institutions of governance that includes our diversity as part and parcel of governance and uses that diversity to generate energy among people to live in one nation. Our present constitution tries to do that. It does that first through devolution. We have 47 counties. Invariably, most of the counties are also ethnically homogeneous. Few include more than 1 or 2 and 3 communities, but in general they tend to be ethnically homogeneous, which means that and then each county is entitled to the national budget according to its numbers, number of people there, geographical expanse and so on. So there's a rationale to accessing national resources for purposes of local development. So that means that politics is now more local. Mm-hmm. And it's a perfect, to me, setting for having a parliamentary system rather than a presidential system, because in any case the presidency is becoming less and less important in this regard, but becoming more important in trying to scramble for the resources at the national level so as to depend on this narrow elite which will feed on the resources of the nation, which is terrible. So once you do that, then people begin appreciating each other. Counties then begin cooperating with each other, that if we are 10 counties which are contiguous to one another, then we can even have a common banking system, an infrastructure that connects us. And now you'll be having national integration based on real people's consent and participation, rather than a formal national integration kind of dictated from above. So I think it's a question of statecraft, or designing our nation in such a way that we appreciate our diversity and we use it as a raw material for building the nation. And we don't use it for individuals who want to get into power to play one ethnic group to the other, so that when they ascend into power, they step on the cadavers of one ethnic group while they are feeding another. I mean, that is what has spoiled Africa.